October 1st, 331 BCE. A 25-year-old king stands on a battlefield where he should not exist. The Persian Empire just deployed 100,000 soldiers on ground. They spent weeks leveling flat. The perfect killing floor for their cavalry and scythe chariots. They have Greek mercenary phalanxes that won't break. They have numerical superiority of nearly 2-to-1. Their line stretches so wide it threatens to wrap around Alexander's entire army like a closing fist. This is Gaugamela. The Persians built the ideal battlefield for their system. And by sunset, Darius III, ruler of the largest empire on earth, will be fleeing for his life for the second time. Here's what they don't tell you. Alexander didn't win because he had a perfect formation. The Persians at Gaugamela had the perfect formation. The Greeks at Issus had elite heavy infantry that should have held. Tyre had walls surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea itself. No formation could touch them. So how does a Macedonian army, outnumbered, facing prepared defenses, fighting enemies who controlled the terrain, break every perfect system put in front of them? The answer isn't what you think. It's not about brave charges or genius tactics in isolation. It's about a toolbox, combined arms, engineering, tempo, and a willingness to personally force the decisive moment even when it nearly killed him. Multiple times. Because here's the truth. The legend glosses over. Alexander got wounded at Gaza, nearly died in India, and spent years bleeding through Bactria and Sogdiana fighting enemies who refused to give him the decisive battle his system was built to win. This is the real Alexander the Great, the one who didn't stop at perfect formations. He broke them. All of them, until there were none left to break. But first, we need to talk about the problem with everything you've heard about Alexander. 0 contemporary accounts exist from his lifetime. None. Every story you know was written decades, sometimes centuries, after his death. Arrian, Plutarch, Diodorus. These writers weren't war correspondents. They were myth-makers working from second-hand sources, court propaganda, and the survivors who wanted their role in history remembered. What does that mean? It means troop numbers are exaggerated, motivations are invented, and the genius formation narrative? It's a simplification designed to make a messy, bloody, decade-long campaign sound like a series of chess moves. The reality was far more brutal, and far more interesting. So let's strip away the legend and ask the real question. What were Alexander's enemies actually bringing to the table? At Issus, Darius had superior numbers and elite Greek mercenaries, heavy infantry trained in the same phalanx warfare Alexander used. At Gaugamela, the Persians prepared the battlefield itself. They leveled the ground. They positioned scythe chariots designed to shred infantry lines. They stretched their formation so wide that flanking Alexander wasn't a tactic, it was geometry. At Tyre, the enemy wasn't even an army. It was a fortress city on an island half a mile from shore, protected by walls and the Mediterranean Sea. And in Bactria, the enemy dissolved. No formations, no pitched battles, just revolts, ambushes, and fortified strongholds in mountains that swallowed armies whole. Each of these enemies had built a system designed to neutralize exactly what Alexander brought. So how do you beat a system built to beat you? The answer starts with understanding what Alexander actually had. Forget the image of a single brilliant formation crushing all opposition. The Macedonian military wasn't a formation. It was a system. Multiple interlocking parts designed to create problems no single solution could answer. First, the sarissa phalanx, 18-foot pikes. Disciplined drilling inherited from Alexander's father, Philip II. These weren't shock troops, they were the anvil. Their job was to pin the enemy in place, to create a wall of iron points so dense that breaking through meant dying on a dozen spears before you reached the men holding them. But here's the thing. The phalanx couldn't win battles alone. It could hold. It could grind. It could fix an enemy in place while they bled, trying to push through. The killing came from somewhere else. Second, the companion cavalry. Elite horsemen in wedge formation, designed for one purpose, piercing enemy lines at the decisive point. These weren't skirmishers. They were the hammer. And Alexander led them personally, every single time. That's not a minor detail. When the companions charged, the king of Macedon was at the front, not watching from a command post, not directing from safety. He was the tip of the spear. Third, light troops, archers, javelin throwers, skirmishers. Their job was disruption, screening the phalanx, harassing enemy flanks, and neutralizing threats like scythed chariots before they could reach the main line. Fourth, the engineering corps. This is the piece most people forget. Alexander didn't just fight battles, he built them. Siege towers, causeways, bridges thrown across rivers in hours. When the enemy's perfect defense was a wall or a city or geography itself, Alexander's engineers turned impossible terrain into a battlefield. 4 components, 4 answers to different problems. And the genius wasn't in any single piece. It was in how they worked together. But there's one more element. The invisible advantage that tied everything together. Tempo. Alexander didn't just fight faster than his enemies, he thought faster, moved faster, made decisions faster. His army could march distances that seemed impossible, pivot from one theater to another before the enemy knew he'd left, and force engagements on ground the opposition hadn't prepared. Look at the timeline after Issus. Alexander doesn't chase Darius immediately. He pivots south, takes the Phoenician coast, besieges Tyre, conquers Egypt, secures his entire rear before turning back to finish the Persian Empire. That's not recklessness. That's a commander who understood that the enemy's greatest weapon was time. Time to regroup, to recruit, to prepare another perfect defense. Alexander never gave them that time. He broke their timeline before he broke their formations. Now let's watch it happen. November 333 BCE. Issus. Darius has assembled a massive army. Estimates vary wildly. Ancient sources claim 600,000. Modern historians suggest 100,000 or less. But the numbers don't matter as much as the composition. Greek mercenary hoplites form the Persian center. These aren't conscripts. They're professionals trained in phalanx warfare, and they know exactly how to fight Macedonians. The Persian plan is simple. Use superior numbers to envelope Alexander's flanks, while the Greek mercenaries hold the center. Classic hammer and anvil, except the Persians are supposed to be the hammer this time. There's just one problem, the battlefield. Issus sits on a narrow coastal plain, pinched between mountains and the Mediterranean Sea. Darius chose this ground to intercept Alexander's supply lines, a smart, strategic move. But tactically, the narrow terrain compresses the Persian army. Their numerical advantage becomes irrelevant. Their cavalry can't sweep wide. Their infantry can't deploy in the deep formations that would let them absorb Macedonian pressure and push back. Alexander sees it immediately. The Macedonian phalanx advances into the Persian center, pinning the Greek mercenaries in brutal close-quarters fighting. The mercenaries hold, they're good, and they know what they're doing, but they can't advance. They're fixed in place. Meanwhile, Alexander leads the companions against the Persian left flank. The charge is surgical, wedge formation, Alexander at the apex. The Persian cavalry on that flank isn't weak, but they're not expecting the king himself to come screaming directly at them. The psychological weight of that moment is impossible to calculate. This isn't a subordinate commander. This is Alexander, in person, leading the charge. The flank buckles. And now Alexander does something that separates him from every other cavalry commander of his era. He doesn't exploit the breakthrough by rolling up the Persian line. He doesn't chase the routing cavalry. He turns inward, toward the center, toward Darius. The entire companion charge becomes a spear aimed at the Persian command structure, not the army, the king. Darius watches his left flank collapse, watches Alexander's cavalry cutting through the chaos toward his position, watches his bodyguards struggle to form a screen, and he runs. The king of kings, ruler of an empire stretching from Egypt to India, flees the battlefield while his army is still fighting. The moment Darius breaks, the battle is over. Persian cohesion collapses. The Greek mercenaries, still holding, still fighting, are suddenly alone in a disintegrating army. Some escape. Most don't. Alexander captures the Persian royal family, Darius's mother, his wife, his children, but Darius himself escapes east. The war isn't over, it's just beginning. Here's what Issus teaches us about Alexander's real methodology. He didn't beat the Persian formation. The terrain beat the Persian formation. Alexander simply recognized that the enemy's greatest strength, numerical superiority, was nullified by geography, and he attacked before they could reposition. Then he targeted the decision point, not the strongest part of the enemy line, not the elite troops, the command structure. Break the king's nerve, and you break the army. But Issus also reveals something else, something the legend doesn't emphasize. Alexander's own center almost broke. The Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia pushed the Macedonian phalanx hard. There were moments, chaotic, bloody moments, where the line wavered. If the companions had been slower, if Alexander's charge had stalled, Issus could have become a catastrophe. Victory wasn't inevitable. It was manufactured, forced into existence through speed, recognition, and a willingness to gamble everything on a single decisive stroke. Remember that. It matters later. 22 months pass. Alexander doesn't chase Darius. Instead, he methodically dismantles Persian power in the eastern Mediterranean. The Phoenician coast falls. City after city surrenders. Except one. Tyre, an island fortress half a mile offshore, walls rising directly from the sea, a navy controlling the surrounding waters. The Tyrians look at Alexander's army on the mainland and feel nothing but contempt. What's he going to do? Swim? Tyre isn't a formation problem. It's a geometry problem. No army can reach an island. No siege weapons can touch walls protected by open water. The Tyrians have food, fresh water from cisterns, and the entire Mediterranean as their moat. This is the perfect defense. And perfect defenses don't lose. Alexander's response is insane. He orders his engineers to build a causeway from the mainland, across the sea, to the island. The army becomes a construction crew. Soldiers haul stones, timber, debris, anything that can be dumped into the water to create land where none exists. Day after day, week after week, the Tyrians respond with fire ships, raids, missiles launched from their walls at the workers below. The first siege towers Alexander builds on the causeway are burned. He builds more. 7 months. That's how long the siege lasts. 7 months of grinding, relentless, brutal engineering warfare. Alexander eventually assembles a fleet from conquered Phoenician cities, former Persian allies who switched sides, and uses it to assault Tyre from the sea while his causeway reaches the walls. When the city falls, the aftermath is savage. Military-age men killed, women and children sold into slavery. The message is clear. Resist, and this is what happens. Strategic intimidation. Calculated brutality designed to make the next city think twice. The causeway still exists today. Alexander literally changed the geography of the Mediterranean. But here's the question. The legend skips over. What did Tyre cost? 7 months, thousands of casualties, resources and time that couldn't be spent elsewhere. Alexander won. But Tyre proves that winning isn't always clean. Sometimes breaking a perfect defense means bleeding for it, dying for it, watching your men get picked off day after day while you slowly, painfully build the impossible. This is the Alexander they don't put in the highlights, the one who grinds. October 1st, 331 BCE. Gaugamela, 2 years after Issus. Darius has rebuilt his army, learned from his mistakes. And this time, he's chosen the battlefield. The plain of Gaugamela is flat, open, cleared of obstacles. Persian engineers spent weeks preparing it, leveling ground, removing anything that might disrupt cavalry charges or chariot wheels. This is the killing floor Darius wanted at Issus, but couldn't get. Scythe chariots, war elephants, cavalry on both flanks stretching beyond the edges of Alexander's line, Greek mercenaries in the center again. The Persian plan is elegant. Let Alexander attack, absorb the blow, then envelope his flanks with superior numbers and crush him from 3 sides. No narrow terrain to save him this time. No geographic tricks, just open ground and mathematics. Alexander is outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. The night before the battle, his generals urge a night attack. Surprise the Persians. Negate their numerical advantage with chaos. Alexander refuses. "I will not steal victory," he reportedly says. Arrogance? Maybe. But there's calculation behind it. A night battle means confusion, friendly fire, units stumbling into each other in the dark. Alexander's greatest advantage, the coordination of his combined arms system, would be neutralized by the very chaos he'd be trying to create. He needs daylight, he needs to see the seams. Dawn breaks. The armies face each other. Alexander does something unexpected. Instead of advancing directly, he moves his entire army obliquely, marching to the right, parallel to the Persian line, pulling away from Darius's prepared killing ground. The Persians react. They extend their left flank to match Alexander's movement, trying to maintain the envelopment. Cavalry units shift. The massive line, so carefully prepared, begins to stretch, thin, and eventually, gap. The Persian line is so wide, so committed to flanking, that the center begins to open. Not much, just a seam. Alexander sees it. The companions charge, not at the Persian cavalry, not at the flanks, directly into the gap, directly toward Darius. Behind them, the Macedonian phalanx surges forward, pinning the Persian center. Light troops screen the scythe chariots, opening lanes for the horses to charge through harmlessly, then cutting down the drivers from behind. The integrated system working exactly as designed. But the companions are the decision. Alexander leads them through the gap like a blade through ribs. Persian infantry scrambles to close the breach. Bodyguards form around Darius. The fighting is close, desperate, and then, for the second time, Darius breaks. The King of Kings turns his chariot and flees. Again. The Persian army doesn't collapse immediately, not like Issus. The left flank is still fighting. Persian cavalry actually breaks through Alexander's line on the opposite side, threatening the Macedonian baggage train. For a moment, the battle hangs in chaos. But it doesn't matter. The command structure is gone. Darius is gone, and an army without a head can fight, but it can't win. Alexander pursues, not the routed infantry, not the confused cavalry. Darius. He chases the Persian king for miles, trying to end the war with a single stroke. He fails. Darkness falls. Darius escapes into the mountains, but the empire is finished. Babylon surrenders without a fight. Susa opens its gates. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persian power, falls and burns. Within months, Alexander controls more territory than any European conqueror in history. Gaugamela wasn't won with a perfect formation. It was won by forcing the enemy's perfect formation to move, to react, to stretch until it tore. The Persians built the ideal battlefield. Alexander found the seam anyway. But the war isn't over. Darius flees east into the empire's outer provinces. Alexander follows. And here, the legend starts to fray. July 330 BCE. Alexander finally catches up to Darius, but not the way he expected. Bessus, one of Darius's own satraps, has murdered the king and claimed the throne for himself. Alexander finds Darius's body in a wagon, stabbed, abandoned. There's a strange moment here. Alexander covers the body with his own cloak, orders a royal funeral. The man he'd been chasing for 3 years, the enemy he'd humiliated twice on the battlefield, receives honors. Why? Maybe respect. Maybe calculation, presenting himself as Darius's legitimate successor rather than a foreign conqueror. Probably both. But Bessus is still out there, and behind Bessus, the eastern provinces are stirring. Bactria, Sogdiana, modern-day Afghanistan, and Central Asia. This is where Alexander's legend meets its grinding, bloody reality check. The enemies here don't form up. No phalanxes, no prepared battlefields, no kings standing in chariots waiting to break. Instead, fortified mountain strongholds, hit-and-run cavalry raids, tribal leaders who surrender, swear loyalty, then revolt the moment Alexander's army moves on. An insurgency that can't be pinned down, can't be caught, can't be beaten in the decisive engagements Alexander's system was built to win. For 3 years, Alexander bleeds through these mountains. 3 years. The same man who broke Persia in 18 months spends twice that long fighting enemies who refuse to give him a battle. His army grows frustrated. Casualties mount, not in glorious charges, but in ambushes, skirmishes, sieges of remote fortresses that mean nothing except that someone inside them won't submit. Alexander adapts. He splits his forces, builds more fortifications, establishes garrisons, marries a local princess, Roxana, to build political alliances, uses diplomacy where force fails. But it's ugly, messy, nothing like the clean victories the legend prefers to remember. And then there's the Malian campaign, 326 BCE, India. Alexander has crossed the Hindu Kush, defeated King Porus at the Hydaspes, and pushed his army to the edge of the known world. His men are exhausted. Some units have been campaigning for 8 years without returning home. The Malians, a confederation of Indian tribes, resist. Alexander besieges their city. What happens next nearly ends everything. The assault stalls, ladders against the walls, Macedonian troops hesitating at the top, unwilling to drop into the city where they'll be surrounded. Alexander doesn't wait. He climbs the ladder himself, jumps down into the city, alone. A handful of bodyguards follow, 3, maybe 4 men, but they're immediately cut off. Alexander fights with his back to the wall, literally, surrounded by enemies. His shield takes arrows, his helmet deflects blows. Then an arrow punches through his armor into his chest. He goes down. The bodyguards form a circle around his body, fighting off attackers until Macedonian troops finally breach the wall and pour into the city. The slaughter that follows is total. The army believes their king is dead, and they take revenge on everything that moves. But Alexander survives. Barely. The arrow pierced his lung. For days, it's unclear if he'll live. When he finally appears before his troops, pale, weak, but alive, grown men weep. This is the Alexander the legend glosses over. Not the untouchable genius. The man who climbed a wall alone because his troops were hesitating. The man who took an arrow to the lung because he couldn't not be first through the breach. The perfect formation narrative makes it sound like Alexander won through superior positioning. The reality? He won because he repeatedly, recklessly, put his own body at the point of maximum danger. Gaza, wounded during the siege. Granicus, nearly killed in the opening cavalry engagement. The Malian city, an arrow in the chest. The legend is built on moments where Alexander should have died and didn't. That's not tactics. That's something else entirely. So what actually beat perfect formations? Not a better formation. A system. Combined arms designed to create problems no single solution could answer. Not superior numbers. Tempo. Moving faster than the enemy's decision cycle, forcing reactions until their carefully prepared positions tore themselves apart. Not just battlefield tactics. Engineering. When the enemy's defense was geography itself, Alexander built roads through the sea. Not abstract strategy. Command. Targeting. Strike the decision point. Break the king, and the army follows. And underneath all of it, brutal, calculated credibility. Tyre's population sold into slavery. Cities that resisted, destroyed. A reputation that made the next enemy think twice about fighting at all. But the legend has limits. Bactria and Sogdiana proved that Alexander's system was built to win battles, not occupations. When the enemy refused to form up, refused to give him the decisive engagement, he bled for years without a clean victory. And his own body proved that reckless personal courage has a price. The wounds accumulated. The arrow in India may have caused damage that never fully healed. In June of 323 BCE, Alexander dies in Babylon. He's 32 years old. Fever, maybe poison, maybe the cumulative toll of wounds, alcohol, and a decade of relentless campaigning. Historians still argue about the cause. His empire fragments within years. His generals tear it apart fighting over the pieces. Everything he built dissolves into successor kingdoms that war with each other for generations. But here's what remains. A methodology, a demonstration that perfect defenses are never perfect, that systems beat formations, that tempo and engineering and targeting decision points can break enemies who should win on paper. Alexander didn't conquer the known world because he had better troops or better ground or better luck. He conquered it because he refused to fight the enemy's kind of battle. When they gave him open ground, he found the seam and drove through it. When they gave him walls, he built land across the sea. When they gave him insurgency, he ground through it year after bloody year. When his own men hesitated, he climbed the wall himself. Perfect formations didn't stop Alexander the Great. Nothing did. Not until his own body gave out at 32.